Hello everyone, welcome to Visan's Anatomy. Today we are going to learn about the skeletal system. The skeleton, which forms the internal framework of the human body, which includes the bones and joints of the body. The main function of the skeletal system, it gives the shape to the body as well as it supports the body. The joints which are present in the bone, that helps in the facilitation of the movement of the limbs, and also it protects the internal organs and produces the blood cells inside the bone, and it acts as the storehouse for the calcium and phosphorus. Even also it helps in the storage of minerals and fats. The main skeletal system, it is divided into two parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the central core unit, which consists of the skull, which forms the face as well as the cranium along with the mandible, and the hyoid bone, which is present just below the mandible, and the whole vertebrae from the neck to the hip region, the whole vertebral column along with the intervertebral disc, and the ribs and the sternum, which is forming the thoracic cage. So altogether the bones which are present in the midline of the body forms the axial skeleton. Whereas the appendicular skeleton, it is formed by the bones which is forming the upper limb as well as the lower limb. The bones which are connecting the upper limb with the thoracic cage, we call it as the shoulder girdle, and the bones which connects the lower limb along with this vertebral column, we call it as the pelvic girdle. The appendicular skeleton, so here in the upper limb, it has the clavicle in the front, which we call it as the collarbone, and on the back we have the shoulder blade or the scapula, and the bone of the arm is the humerus, and the bone of the forearm, here we have two bones, the radius and ulna, and the bones of the wrist, we call it as the carpal bones, and the bones which are present in the hand, we call it as hand in the sense in the palm, we call it as the metacarpals, and the bones forming the fingers, we call it as the phalanges. And even in the lower limb also we'll have the hip bone, and the bone of the thigh is femur, and bones of calf or the tibia and fibula, and the bones of ankle joint, we call it as the tarsal bones, and bones in the foot, we call it as the metatarsal bones, and the bones of the toes, we call it as the phalanges. So altogether in an adult skeleton, we'll have 206 bones, whereas in the fetal skeleton, they will have larger number of bones because all the bones are not completely fused. They are in segments. So almost about 270 bones are seen in the fetal skeleton. The bones can be classified in a different ways. So first, according to the shape, it is divided. First is the long bones. Long bones in the sense when we are looking at the bone, it will be quite long and tall. And a long bone should have basically three parts. It should have a upper end, a lower end. In between the ends we have a shaft. So for example, the bones present in the upper limb and the lower limb, they forms the long bones. And short long bones. Short long bones in the sense they are also a long bone. Long bone in the sense it should have a upper end and lower end and a shaft, but they are small in size, short in size. For example, here we can able to see the metacarpals. So here it has a upper end and lower end and a shaft, but they are short in size. So this we call it as the short long bones. And short bones, they are very small in nature, where we can see it in the wrist as well as in the ankle joint. So these we call it as the short bones. And flat bones are when we touch it or when we look at the bone, it will be flat, totally flat. So we can see the sternum, the ribs, they are flat bones. And irregular bones, irregular in the sense which doesn't have any proper shape. So here we can see the vertebra with a with winged-like structure, so it doesn't have any proper shape. So the vertebra comes under the irregular bones. And next is sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bone in the sense the bone which is developed inside the tendon of a muscle. The best example is the patella. And the sutural bones mainly we can see in the skull, which are present in between the sutures. So sutures are nothing but the joints between the skull bones, and this sutural bones, they are also called as the Birmingham bones. And the bone can be divided according to its structure. So according to the structure, the bone is divided into two types as the compact bone and spongy bone. The compact bone is dense, thick and strong when compared with the spongy bone. So here in the cross section of a compact bone, we can able to see many round circular structures. So each circular round structure we call it as a osteon or Haversian system. So here also in the slide picture we can able to see the concentric Haversian system. So in one Haversian system, in the middle we can see the Haversian canal, where we can see the arteries, veins and the nerves passing through. So surrounding the Haversian canal, we can see the layers of bone, which we call it as the concentric lamellae. In between the concentric lamellae, we can see the cells of the bone called as the osteocytes. And in between each Haversian system, in the middle, in between also we can able to see the layer of bone called as the interstitial lamellae. And surrounding the whole bone, we can able to see the layer of bone called as the circumferential lamellae. And the bone on the outer aspect, it is covered by the periosteum. And next is the spongy bone. Spongy bone, as the name indicates, which gives a spongy appearance. So here we can see the spongy appearance. If we look closer inside, the spongy bone gives a network-like appearance. So here the lamellae are divided, branched, which we call it as a trabeculae, which gives a network-like appearance and occupies many spaces, which gives a spongy appearance. And in both the type of bones, we can see the cells of the bone. Basically, we call it as the osteocyte, which has many projections surrounding it, and osteoblast is the bone forming cells and osteoclast is the bone removing cells. The parts of the long bone, basically the long bone have a shaft in the middle, which we call it as the diaphysis. At both the ends, upper end as well as the lower end, the end portion we call it as the epiphysis. In the middle of the shaft, we can see the cavity called as medullary cavity. At the junction of the shaft as well as both the ends, so here we can able to see the growth plate. Growth plate is nothing but a cartilaginous structure, which is the active area where the cell divides and which helps in the growth of the long bone. This picture shows the junction, the area of the growth plate. So here if we see, this is the basic germinal zone where the cells are divided, which gets matured and finally which converts into a bone. So the damage to the bone is nothing but we call it as the fractures. So if the fracture is only just like a crack which is not completely passing through the bone, we call it as green stick fracture. If the fracture or the breakage is in the horizontal plane, we call it as transverse fracture. If it is in the vertical plane, we call it as linear fracture. If it is in the slanting position, we call it as oblique fracture. And if the fracture has happened and the bone is moved from its position, this is called as a displaced fracture. And if the bone is broken into pieces, so this we call it as a compound or comminuted fracture. So for the fracture of bones, basically we can see through the radiograph. So here we can see the many radiograph pictures which shows the fracture of the bones, and here we can see the displaced bones also. So for the fracture, the main treatment is the bone has to be placed in its position and it has to be aided with a strong plaster. which helps the bone to be in position and to get healed properly. And if this treatment is not supporting, so then it has to be supported with the plate and the screw through the surgical procedures. And after the treatment, the patient should be given the physiotherapy in order to keep the muscles in the viable condition. And thank you so much for listening to this class. Share and subscribe the channel, and online classes as well as the coachings are undertaken. Students, those who are interested, can contact me through the email ID given below. I'll meet you in the next class. Bye bye.